The period between the pastorates of A.L. Frisbie and Stoddard Lane was just 20 years, from 1899 to 1929. But remarkable years they were. In those 20 brief years, Plymouth Church had 4 very different pastors, built 2 impressive buildings, moved from downtown to the western outskirts of the city, engaged in significant community outreach, and even survived a modest pastoral scandal. And through it all, the congregation continued to grow in size and in influence. By the end of this period, the stage was set for a brand new ministry in a grand new setting. But that, too, turned out to be full of surprises. The story begins with Frisbie's immediate successor, Francis J. Van Horn. Van Horn was a young, able, and apparently a bit flamboyant as a pastor, if we judge by his stylish appearance and sporty pompadour. But giants cast a long shadow. A.L. Frisbie was a tough act to follow at Plymouth and Des Moines. There's a saying in church circles that a pastor who follows immediately after a long and successful pastorate is likely to become a sacrificial lamb. People never forgive the new minister for being different, and so the new person never really gains permission to be the pastor. This is particularly likely to happen when the previous pastor hangs around and has trouble letting go. Van Horn began in 1899 with high hopes and great energy. His motto was, "A new church for a new century." He proceeded to try to establish himself as Plymouth's pastor and to lead the church through a much-needed building program, as the building from the 1870s was growing inadequate to Plymouth's membership and program. This greeting from a church directory in 1900 gives us some insight into Van Horn's energy and enthusiasm. For the first time in many years, a new name is signed to your pastor's message. The old order changeth is the way of the world, and may be of heaven also. New things should mark progress. The new year, the new pastorate should also mean new endeavors, new purposes, new consecration. May it be so. It is a great thing to be a member of Christ's conquering church, a great thing to be one of the Plymouth people. I congratulate you on your privilege. We are bound together in the Master's service by high and holy vows. Let us keep and fulfill our promises, remembering that our names are on another book as well. May it be to each of us the book of life. And to any who may read this message, but whose name does not appear within, come. If you are one of God's children worshiping with us, you ought to be one of us. Plymouth Church is going to grow, and this promise is to those who confess me before men, and the church is his body. It was said of the early church, "Behold how these Christians love each other." Let it be said of us. Use this book as a help to acquaintance and friendship. Pray for these fellow members. Crowd the church on the Sabbath. Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together on Wednesday evening. Let the Word of God dwell in you richly. Thankful for all the past, look out to the future with a great expectation from God, and pray for him who ceases not to pray for you, that the Word of God at his mouth may have free course and be glorified. In bonds of loving service, your pastor, F.J. Van Horn. That's beautiful language, and a lot of energy, a lot of sincerity. Here's a picture of the church built at 8th and Pleasant, and a magnificent structure it was. It was built on the Akron plan, a popular design for churches of the time. Notice in this diagram of the main level how the auditorium, or sanctuary on the right, is separated from the lecture room, or educational area, on the left. The wall separating those two areas could be rolled up, making the entire area accessible to a single speaker on occasions when a large crowd was assembled, for example, Easter Sunday. Alternatively, with the dividing wall in place, educational classes or a children's worship service could be held on one side while adult worship was happening on the other. This promotional brochure describes the financial commitment sought from the congregation. Notice that the hope is that some $30,000 additional will be raised in order that the building might be dedicated free from debt. And it says optimistically, and nothing else is contemplated. Well, that dream of dedicating the building debt-free was not realized, and debt on the building would be a major factor in the ministry of Van Horn's successor. Here we see a photograph of the interior of the church, completed in 1902 at a cost of $115,000. The wall is open in the photograph, and you can see across into the educational area. The speaker's platform, or the pulpit, would be to the right, just out of view. This photo is taken from the choir loft, looking out into the sanctuary. I'm particularly taken with the curved pews and the sloping floor. And notice the rose window, and the balconies, and the ornate ceiling. It was quite a space. Here's a view of the educational area. Notice it's all set up for a lecture. And here is a view into one of the Sunday school rooms, this one for primary children. On the lower level of the building was a large dining room. Here the congregation is gathered for a meal. I don't know what the capacity is, but it looks like a pretty big crowd in there. Also on the lower level was the kitchen, equipped with hot and cold running water. Returning upstairs, we find the ladies' parlor, suitable for formal social events. And here is the church library. Notice that on the desk there is a typewriter. Everything's up to date in Des Moines. In a few moments we'll see some documents that no doubt were produced on that typewriter. Returning to the sanctuary, here is a view of the organ. It was a gift from the Turner family, who owned the streetcar line in town. Here is a picture of Mrs. Mary Turner, or Mother Turner, as she was known. The organ cost $10,000. When the church was torn down in the 1920s, the organ was moved to the new building at 42nd and Ingersoll, and it remained in service until 1961. Other elements from that 8th and Pleasant Church continue as a part of the life in the present Plymouth. This east window of the risen triumphant Christ is visible today in the east transept of our sanctuary. And next to it is this window of Christ knocking at the door. It was in the choir loft of the 8th and Pleasant Church. As you may recall, this window is dedicated in honor of A.L. Frisbie. Another artifact of that fascinating building is the cornerstone. Today it is located just off the tower room at the head of the stairs leading down to the Plymouth Nursery School. Here's a close-up of it. 1901. Cornerstone laid in 1901 and the building dedicated in 1902. The building was a remarkable accomplishment, but Van Horn still had a painfully brief pastorate. Throughout his tenure, A.L. Frisbie was pastor emeritus and very much in evidence in the church and in the community. Bulletins and programs of the time document Frisbie's activity as a speaker in various settings. He was very prominent. And Martha Frisbie was the president of the Women's Missionary Society of the church and continued in that key leadership role for many more years. Nowadays, all the parties would be schooled in the ethics of maintaining proper roles and spiritual boundaries, but that was a different time, and I suspect things were difficult for everyone. Van Horn resigned to go to Old South Church in Worcester, Massachusetts. But before he left, he shared his vision for a Plymouth of more than 1,000 members. Here is his resignation letter. I suspect that it was typed on that typewriter that we saw just a moment ago. To the Plymouth Congregational Church, Des Moines, Iowa, dear friends, I tender to you herewith my resignation of the pastorate of this church, that I may accept the call of the Old South Congregational Church, Worcester, Mass. This act to take effect Sunday, October 12th next. That would be about 3 weeks from the date of this letter. I pray you to accept this resignation and to join with me in calling a mutual council of dismission to terminate this pastorate in accordance with established congregational usage. There are some words of gratitude acknowledging the grief in the severance of the relationship, and then a paragraph of regret, and I think we can read between the lines here and feel that in some ways it may have been difficult for Van Horn to feel himself accepted as a pastor. He writes, I should be remiss, too, if this letter did not record a hearty appreciation of your kindness and forbearance in view of shortcomings. Many things have been left undone which a better man would have found time and strength to have done. Doubtless also mistakes have been made, wrong judgments formed, hasty and unwise words spoken, but you have caught at the spirit of the intent rather than the letter of its accomplishment. You have been charitable, and I trust forgiving. For this I thank you. He then expresses his confidence in the future of the church and recounts his thanks once again. As was the custom of the day, Van Horn's letter was responded to via a resolution on the part of the congregation called a memorial of regret. Here, too, we gain a sense of some of the unfulfilled promise of the pastorate. When in the providence of God it seems wisest and best that the relation of a pastor to his people should terminate, there is always deep sorrow, as in the sundering of all near and dear human ties. And this is the more intensified if the ties between the pastor and his people have been especially intimate and helpful. Plymouth Congregational Church is now called to such a separation, and we desire to express our profound regret that our beloved and honored pastor, Reverend Francis J. Van Horn, has felt it his duty to dissolve his connection with this church and accept the call of the Old South Church, Worcester, Mass, to take up the larger work and broader field of usefulness as the pastor of that great church. And here's some genuine words of appreciation. Under Mr. Van Horn's able and courageous leadership, our church has been inspired to arise and build a commodious and beautiful temple for the worship of God, and the membership of the church has been greatly increased. Meetings were held prior to the completion of the new church in the Opera House and Auditorium, which were unequaled in interest and unsurpassed in attendance, often counting 3,000 or more at the Sabbath evening service for many weeks together. Nor were Mr. Van Horn's labors successful only in building up the externals of the church, but he has striven with great earnestness and faithfulness to impress upon his hearers the beauty of the life of the Divine Master, whose ambassador he is. It's really a lovely letter, thanking Van Horn and commending him to Old South Church in Worcester. We are truly blessed to have these documents in our archives. Not only do they evoke the time in which they were written and provide us with much useful information, they also set a standard for future pastoral departures. Van Horn's successor was Frank W. Hodgson, of whom there is no photograph I've been able to find in our archives. Hodgson was called from East Orange, New Jersey. His acceptance of the call is dated March 26, 1903. After Van Horn's brief pastorate, one might hope that the church would have been determined to allow the next pastor a bit more leeway to conduct his own ministry. But Hodgdon's handwritten reply to the letter of call is addressed to Dr. Frisbie. Frisbie was the head of a 3-person search committee. Hodgdon was installed on December 15, 1903. He was the young, gifted, and enterprising minister referred to at the end of Frisbie's 75th birthday sermon in 1905, as our class noted last fall when we read that sermon together. He was remembered later by those who knew him as a very fine and dedicated man, perhaps not the best businessman. The church has serious debts. This observation will prove to be important to the story that follows. Hodgdon didn't build a building, but he certainly did build the church. 461 new members were received during his first 6 years. He was a good friend of Rabbi Mannheimer, who served at Temple B'nai Jeshurun from 1905 to 1943, and who would later be a good friend of Stoddard Lane. Mannheimer and Hodgdon started out together. There was a frequent exchange of speakers between the two congregations. Frank Hodgdon was remembered warmly for his weekly men's Sunday school class held in the sanctuary at the foot of the pulpit. And each Wednesday he offered a class for the church school teachers to help them prepare for the coming Sunday. It was Frank Hodgdon who presided over Plymouth's 50th anniversary in 1907. And during Hodgdon's ministry, the choir became known throughout the city as the choir for serious musicians. It grew in numbers and in musical accomplishment. Each year when they finished their season in the spring, there would be a picture in the paper with the names of all the choir members listed. But there were growing pains as well. Hodgdon was criticized for a lack of pastoral visitation on the part of his wife. Fanny Hines was hired as a pastoral visitor to take up the slack. Once again, it was Mrs. Frisbie who was the standard. She was later quoted as saying this, supposedly in Mrs. Hodgdon's defense. "People do not realize that while my children were small, my mother lived with us, and I could almost always go at will for any pastor calls. Mrs. Hodgdon had 3 children and no help." Evidently, it didn't occur to anybody to wonder why they would expect the pastor's wife to do the pastor's work. On December 29, 1910, Frank Hodgdon resigned to go to the First Congregational Church in Winchester, Massachusetts, effective February 1, 1911. In his letter of resignation, he writes this: "This field has its difficulties, but its difficulties are to me absolutely nothing as compared with the rewards received for service already rendered, the fine inspirations of friendships and confidences which are mine, and the reasonable promises for the future, if the Church remains steadfastly progressive, as I am sure it would do under my continued leadership, and which I personally trust will be done under the leadership of another. Every live institution has problems. This institution has them, but I rejoice that I can frankly say that our problems have never discouraged me, so that even by a suggestion have I sought an opportunity to forsake them." One can sense the strain in these words. Perhaps he should have quit while he was ahead, but he went on to write this of the call to Greater Boston: "In every single particular, wherein comparison is possible, this invitation opens to me an opportunity so far superior to any that this field could afford, that the superiority is self-evident." Not exactly words from a silver tongue. Not surprisingly, there is no memorial of regret in the Plymouth archives. Churches have a habit of hiring the shadow of the person that they just had, compensating for weaknesses and in the process ignoring areas of strength that they've come to take for granted. If they've had a wonderful preacher who was a bit introverted, they will often go for a warm and fuzzy person whose preaching turns out to be suspect. If they've had someone who is a bit loose with administration, they will often hire someone who is well organized, but not particularly kind. And so it goes. In part, I suspect because of Frank Hodgdon's perceived deficiencies as a businessman, he was succeeded by J. Edward Kirby, who brought strong business credentials to the position. A 1978 written history of Plymouth Church describes the period of the Kirby pastorate as colorful years at the church. It further observes that Dr. Kirby was a good businessman and succeeded in putting Plymouth on a sound financial basis. When he resigned the pastorate of Plymouth, so the story goes, Kirby decided to embark on a financial career. As often turns out to be the case, the reality seems to be a little bit more complex. Kirby's background is not entirely clear. He was born on December 23rd, 1873 in Greenbush, Michigan. He attended Hillsdale College for 3 years, studying literature, and he spent a final year at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. I find no indication of any advanced degrees in theology or anything else, but he is always referred to as Dr. Kirby. And he became president and professor of history at Drury College in Springfield, Missouri. But that's an interesting thing. A Drury College online newsletter from September 12th of 2007 has some fascinating things to say as it reviews the presidential history at Drury as background for an upcoming presidential search. President number 4 is J. Edward Kirby, 1905 to 1907. Without elaboration, it indicates that he was forced to resign. This was 3 years before he came to Plymouth. So maybe in a sense he carried his own colorfulness around with him. Under Kirby's pastorate, Plymouth continued to grow. The Iowa Congregational Hospital was begun as the brainchild of Dr. George Royal of the North Park Congregational Church. They started with those $12 left over from the Sunbeam Rescue Mission and not much else. The hospital failed largely due to a lack of church support. At one point, Kirby even introduced a resolution at the state conference declaring that the churches would bear no financial responsibility for the hospital. The Waveland Park Church was also begun during this time, in 1915, and it would later merge with Plymouth. But probably the most distinctive feature of Plymouth Church during Kirby's decade of service was our support of World War I. Plymouth took an active role in politics and in the war effort. This, in fact, was characteristic of liberal churches during this era. World War I was viewed as the war to end all wars. This was the effort to make the world safe for democracy, and Plymouth offered enthusiastic support. According to the 1978 written church history, the soldiers stationed at Camp Dodge were welcomed each Sunday. Sundays at Plymouth were geared especially for the soldiers: music, vespers, social events. Kirby was a self-styled poet, and some of his most ardent efforts were reserved for patriotic themes, also frequently the subject matter of his sermons. Here's a poem entitled "Why We Fight." He says, among other things, "We have no selfish interests. Our hopes are all for men. When wilt thou save the people, O God of mercy, when? So waves our starry emblem. There are no royal bars in our flag that waves for freedom with its blue field full of stars." This issue of Plymouth Tidings, the weekly bulletin from March of 1918, lists the Reverend Isaac Castle as Director of War Work. The announcements of the day emphasize the church's commitment. Here's a close-up. The National Service Commission has asked Mr. Castle to secure a leave of absence from his church for at least 1 year. His church has considered the matter and granted him this release for 1 year beginning March 1st, 1918. This will make it possible for him to continue in the war work. The resolutions passed by the church closed with the following paragraph: "Be it still further resolved that we shall continue to regard Mr. Castle as our pastor, and as such shall hold him in our thoughts and prayers, with the expectation that he will return to the pastorate of the church not later than March 1st, 1919. Here's another poetic offering from Dr. Kirby, published at Thanksgiving of 1918. It's a poem entitled Men of the Blood and Mire. We whom the draft rejected, we who stay by the stuff, we who measure our manhood and find that it isn't enough, we who are gray and burdened, we whom the trades require, will you permit us to hail you, men of the blood and mire? We of the thundering forum, we of the pen and press, we who are pouring our utmost into our land's success, we of the cross and triangle, lofty in deed and desire, God, how we shrivel before you, men of the blood and mire. Aye, we are square with conscience, we are reservists all. Aye, when your ranks are gaping, we will fight where you fall. Yet while we wait, your altars flame in the gas and fire. We are the shades of your glory, men of the blood and mire. If you'll forgive the expression, that seems to me to be just a bit over the top. Not all of Kirby's poems were on war themes. This one is a rather sentimental Christmas offering from 1915. Kirby left Plymouth very abruptly in 1920. Here a newspaper article announces Kirby's intention to resign its services the following day, so folks read about it in the paper before they heard about it from their pastor. The Reverend J. Edward Kirby, pastor of Plymouth Congregational Church and active in Des Moines civic life for the past 10 years, announced today that he will tender his resignation as pastor of the church to the congregation at tomorrow's services. He will ask that the resignation take effect immediately. He expects to remain in Des Moines, according to a formal statement given out today. He expresses his intent to become involved in political activity. And it says down below, in an informal interview, Dr. Kirby indicated that his resignation is in response to pressure within the congregation, and stated that he expects to devote considerable attention to fighting the cancer of greed and graft in public life during the current state campaign and for so long as he remains in Iowa. Obviously, there is some serious tension here. Later accounts help us piece the story together. Kirby was very involved with fundraising for an organization for Near East relief. This is a copy of a news release that is in our archives because of something that was on the back of it. You notice that the print on the front has been crossed out. But this is an appeal for funds to assist Armenian refugees, a very worthy cause. The close-up shows Kirby's name on the letterhead, and here is some of the text. It is difficult for the people of prosperous Iowa to realize the sufferings of Armenian refugees, says Dr. J. Edward Kirby, State Director of the Near East Relief. And it goes on to describe the plight of Armenian refugees. But Kirby and church leaders got into a tussle when it was revealed that he was being paid $200 per month for this fundraising activity. That's in addition to his Plymouth salary. Here is the notice from the September 7th, 1920 newspaper announcing that Plymouth is seeking a new pastor. And as for Kirby, he did pursue a career in business. Here is a picture from a trade publication in September of 1925 in which Kirby has an article about success in banking. There is no memorial of regret at his leaving. He remained in Des Moines, and he helped found two banks, the Morris Plan Bank and the Citizens Industrial Company. He relocated to Michigan in the mid-1920s, and in 1928 he returned to the ministry at the United Church of Raleigh, North Carolina. I don't know what kind of United Church that would have been. It was long before the beginnings of the United Church of Christ. In his obituary, Kirby is credited with founding Atlanta Theological Seminary, which later merged with Vanderbilt School of Religion, but I can't find any trace of that. He died on November 14, 1939, in Memphis, Tennessee. J. Edward Kirby was a complicated character, somebody I'd like to know more about. Our official histories of the time are strangely superficial. But I like this quotation credited to him from the early days of World War I. He wrote, "We need to remember that there are thousands of people in Germany who are not sympathetic with the war machine and whose voices are silent only because the power of the sword has made them so." Kirby's successor, the Reverend Bertus R. McCatton, was his direct polar opposite in many respects. McCatton had clear and impressive academic and ecclesiastical credentials. He was ordained in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in June of 1899. He attended Lake Forest Academy, the University of Worcester, Western Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, and conducted postgraduate study in Leipzig, Germany. He lived abroad from 1906 to 1914 as pastor of the British Church in Leipzig, and had pastorates in two Pittsburgh churches and in Great Falls, Montana, prior to coming to Des Moines. And McCatton was remarkably cultured and sophisticated, something of a Renaissance man. Here's a brochure announcing his availability to lecture on a broad range of subjects: art, literature, travel, history, theology. And here is a picture of McCatton with the choir in the 8th and Pleasant Sanctuary. Notice that in these days he preached in a morning coat. And notice also that evidently some members of the congregation were allergic to him. McCatton inherited the delicate negotiation process that eventually would lead to the merger of Plymouth, Greenwood, and Waveland Park churches. Formal records from 1920 recount talks between Plymouth and the Greenwood Church begun while J. Edward Kirby was still the Plymouth pastor. With his abrupt departure, conversations went on the back burner for a time. Written histories all suggest that the downtown Plymouth was simply bursting at the seams and therefore needed to relocate. But there are also indications that there were problems with the 8th and Pleasant building, including a leaky roof and plumbing and electrical difficulties. And the downtown neighborhood was changing. The Waveland Park Church, founded at 42nd and University in 1915, was attracting large numbers of families with children from the outlying areas. This picture of the Waveland Park Church picnic in 1922 shows that there were lots of children. And the Greenwood Church on 35th Street was also doing a better job of attracting young families. So Plymouth downtown was aging. The population of Des Moines was moving west, making the downtown area seem a less desirable place to live. Raise your hand if any of this begins to sound familiar. So all these factors impelled Plymouth to be thinking about alternatives. In 1921, the Greenwood Church voted unanimously to proceed with merger talks. But Plymouth leadership declined to bring the matter to a formal vote, even as church leaders, Harry G. Wallace prominent among them, continued to work behind the scenes. In December of 1922, a Plymouth straw poll tallied 218 votes for and 114 votes against merger consideration. So the leadership proceeded, albeit cautiously. So in 1924, when the city of Des Moines wanted to seize the Plymouth building at 8th and Pleasant for the building of Keogh Way, an opportunity opened up. There's a thick file of minutes and documents detailing the painstaking process by which the churches agreed to merge, land was purchased from the county family, and plans were drawn for the new building. A building brochure says that the committee modeled its vision after Plymouth Congregational Church in Minneapolis and First Central Congregational Church in Omaha, the congregation I served for 17 years before coming to Plymouth. No wonder I felt right at home here. The two congregations worshipped together in the Plymouth congregation worshipped in the 8th and Pleasant building for the last time on Easter Sunday of 1926. Then key items, the organ, windows, and cornerstones were salvaged from the downtown church. Then the two congregations, Plymouth and Greenwood, worshipped together in the Greenwood Sanctuary as the construction of the new Plymouth building began on 42nd and Ingersoll. Here is a letter summoning people to a meeting to review the proposed plans for the church, a brochure regarding which they had just received in the mail. It must have been a very exciting time and also a little scary. Here's what it has to say about the finances. The plan favored by the Executive Committee provides for amortizing the construction cost over a period of 15 years. With upkeep included, our members will not be asked to contribute amounts beyond their reach, and the campaign committee is confident that the plans recommended by the building committee can be carried through, enabling Plymouth Church to render exceptional and outstanding service to the neighboring community in particular and the city of Des Moines in general. And of course, that economic forecast turned out to be quite optimistic, overly optimistic, in light of the Great Depression, which no one could foresee at this point. And rather than paying off the debt in 15 years, it actually took 25 years. Here is an article from the Des Moines Register, which announces the worshiping of the congregation in a portion of the new building. The article announces services to begin in the parish hall of the new Plymouth on December 19th, 1926. With the opening of the religious education unit, the Plymouth Congregational Church has finished about half of its building program, which will cost $350,000 at completion, and the actual cost was $475,000. The unit has 3 floors and is equipped with community rooms, Sunday school and assembly rooms, and a large dining room on the first floor. There really is a great vision here. And so here in this famous picture of the laying of the cornerstone for the sanctuary, you can see the completed educational wing in the background, in which the congregation had already begun to worship on the first floor in what later would be called Waveland Hall. Here at the laying of the cornerstone is Martha Frisbie, A.L. Frisbie's widow. He had died in 1917. And next to her is Dr. Bertus McCatton. And next to McCatton is Harry G. Wallace, who was the chair of the building committee and a major force in the accomplishment of this great task. A newspaper article from March 15th of 1927 shows the remarkable progress of the building. And here is the finished sanctuary, which was dedicated on November 20th, 1927. McCatton's was a remarkable ministry. He presided over the acquisition of the new property from the county family, the merger with Greenwood and ultimately the Waveland Park churches, and the construction of the new building. Plymouth membership increased by 790 above and beyond the mergers during the McCatton years, and when he left, Plymouth had 1,300 members. He was the first to broadcast services over WHO radio, a practice that continued into the 1990s. And it was he who proposed carving the words, "Love Never Faileth," over the altar in the Plymouth sanctuary. McCatton was a thoughtful and intellectual pastor. As Plymouth made the move to its grand new surroundings, he observed, "Protestant churches have thrown away all the ritualistic effects without retaining the religious awe we need. Without accepting the pomp and candles of our ritualistic brethren, we can still have enough to recover some of the symbolism and restore some of the mysticism." Here is an article announcing his retirement and recounting his accomplishments. On the 30th anniversary of his ordination to the ministry, Dr. Bertus R. McCatton will retire both from the pastorate of Plymouth Congregational Church and from the ministry. Sunday morning, he announced his resignation to take effect the last Sunday in June. He expects to join his wife and children in England and to spend the rest of his life there, he announced. He plans to do some writing and lecturing. No problem, by the way, with him meddling in the affairs of his successor. Under the leadership of Dr. McCatton, Plymouth Church purchased the block between 41st and 42nd Streets fronting on Ingersoll Avenue and planned for a complete church plant to include a religious education building and a community house as well as a large church. The church plant, which was completed at a cost of $475,000, now stands as one of the finest in the city. After the project was started, Greenwood Congregational Church and later Waveland Congregational Church both united with Plymouth Church, making it the only church of the denomination in the city. It now has a membership of more than 1,300. Dr. McCatton increased the church membership by 790 during his 8-year pastorate, exclusive of the members from Waveland and Greenwood churches. And last year, the church served as the host of the state congregational meeting, with Dr. McCatton in charge of the gathering. Since the opening of the new church, Dr. McCatton has broadcast sermons every few weeks over WHO. He's a member of the Rotary and Prairie Clubs of Des Moines. When he left, there is no recorded memorial of regret. Probably nobody remembered ever having done such a thing. But the stage was set for the remarkable ministry of Stoddard Lane, and it is to the Lane years that we turn next.